Hey everybody, it's Courtney, and I am very excited to introduce you to the very first card kit by Create and Inkspire. So we're going to take a look at what comes in the kit. Each month you'll receive a little insert here with all of the contents within the kit. This month we have two stamp sets. We have the Wildflower Stamp Set. This is a 4x6 stamp set. And we also have a 3x4 stamp set, and this is where your sentiments are. That way our images can be a little bit bigger. We also have a bottle of masking fluid by Nuvo. We also have some shimmer powder by Nuvo, and I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce this. And we have some embellishments by Trinity Stamps, because nobody does it better than Trinity Stamps when it comes to embellishments. We have some twine. We have 2 pieces of the tonic watercolor card. We have 2 stencils. We have the Wildflower Meadow stamp set as well as the grass and clouds. So we have one side is the grass, one side is the clouds. We have a piece of pearlescent cardstock, which is very hard to see on camera, by Tonic, a piece of Nina Desert Storm, and 2 pieces of what I use for card bases because everybody asks me what I use, and this is by Mohawk. So for our first card, it's super simple. I'm taking a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock and 3 colors of Distress Oxide inks. And I'm just going to create a border on the bottom piece or bottom portion of my card panel. And I'm just plopping on the color. No rhyme or reason to it, not doing any specific kind of shading or anything like that. I'm just plopping down all 3 of the greens. I started with the lightest and I'll finish with the lightest just to kind of get everything to blend a little bit easier. And I was going to do 2 layers of this. I was just going to shift it and do another one, but I figured this was good enough. So for my sentiment, I'm going to be using 2 of the sentiments from the 3x4 stamp set. I'm going to start by lining up the My Friend, which is the largest sentiment, right there directly onto my card panel. I'm using my Misty just to make sure that I have everything centered, and I'm going to be stamping with the Distress Oxide, and sometimes you don't get a great impression the first time, so figured I'll use my Misty just in case. Now for the rest of my sentiment, I'm going to create a sentiment strip, but I wanted this to match the rest of my card. So I'm going to do some embossed resist. I treated a piece of white cardstock with my anti-static tool, stamped out the sentiment with some Versamark ink and sprinkled on some white embossing powder and then heat set that. Now you will want to make sure that your embossing powder is completely cool before adding your ink on top of it, or else you're just going to smear that embossed area around. It only takes about 20 seconds or so, but just be sure that the paper is cool to the touch. So I'm just going to use my blending brush here to add some color, and then just take a paper towel just to wipe off any excess ink that might be sitting on top of that embossed area. Went ahead and cut this down into a pretty thin sentiment strip. This will go directly underneath my Friend sentiment. But before I do that, I went ahead and trimmed down my panel just a little bit on the top and a little bit on either side, just to make sure that it was dimensional and that you could still see a majority of the images on the bottom. Also cut down a piece of white cardstock, just a little bit larger than this one, but still smaller than my card base. Want my card base to appear green, and I want the green to match my images naturally. So I'm taking my card base, and I always use a white card base, and I'm just masking off the top, and I'm just going to do a little bit of ink blending with one of those greens around all 4 edges. You're not going to see the middle, so it doesn't really matter, but this will make it appear as if I'm using a colored card base rather than just a white one, and still keep the middle easy to write on when you address it to the recipient. So layering everything together, I'm going to take my main card panel, layer that onto the white piece of cardstock that is cut just a little bit larger, and then layer that onto the card base, just leaving a little bit of that green border. And then I will pop up my sentiment strip with some foam tape directly underneath that other sentiment. And of course, added some of the embellishments that come in the kit from Trinity Stamps. I just use my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere these down. You can use anything that you want, but just make sure that you're not using too much, because it will squish out once you add your embellishment. And once it dries, even if it dries matte, it will kind of look a little bit clunky or clumpy. I should say. But that is it for card number 1. Moving on to card number 2, I am going to be using the shimmer powder that comes in the kit, as well as a piece of the watercolor cardstock. And I'm just tapping on some of this powder, and I started out really light just because I never want to add too much to begin with. And then I'm just going to spritz this with some water, and I'm not adding too much water here, just enough to kind of activate the powder. Now this powder, I know it's very hard to see on camera, is kind of a tone, it's kind of like a golden yellow, but it has these little sprays of a dark pink, a darker bright pink kind of. It's hard to explain the color, but it's very, very pretty. I ended up wanting to add a little bit more, so I just added that right on top of the panel that's already wet and then set that aside to dry. Taking 2 of the images from the Wildflower Stamp Set, and I'm going to stamp these with some fade out ink by Ink on 3 because I'm going to be doing some no-line Copic coloring. Stamp this onto some Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I did stamp it twice just to make sure that you guys are able to see it on camera. Now, I'm not going to show you all of the coloring because, as you can see, this video is extremely long and I don't want to make it overly long. We'd be here for about 3 hours together. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of it, just mainly showing you the technique that I used as well as the color combination. I started right with the darkest color just because this color combination tends to bleed a little bit. So minimizing the amount of saturation that we have on the paper will minimize that, our chances of the colors bleeding. So I added a little bit of shading where one petal is laying under another, and you can also see that I added kind of like a little U on the top of the petal, and that's just where the petal is kind of caved in on itself, or wrinkled, I guess you could say, and this will just add some texture. It's not going to be too noticeable when you're only doing one petal at a time, and just keep in mind that no line coloring, it's going to look bad before it's going to look good, so don't get too discouraged. Keep on going. Wait till you get at least mostly done with the image before you figure out whether or not you're going to be using it or not. So I went ahead and finished up the rest of the flower, and for the stems and leaves, I'm going to use the same color combination. I'm going to switch over to some YG90s, just adding a little bit of shading underneath where the stem kind of meets the flower, and then on the base of each one of the leaves. Also added a little bit of shading where the stems of the leaves meet the stem of the flower. That would kind of create a little bit, not really of a shadow, but it would have different color variations, I should say. Blended that out with the YG97, YG95, and then I'll finish off with the YG91. Now I'm going to use the same color combination for this other image here that is just leaves, and I'm pretty much going to do the same thing, but I did keep all of the coloring for this particular image in here, even though you'll see in a minute I didn't actually use it on this card. So I'm taking the darkest color and just coloring in the stem itself, and I'm going to add some shading on the base of each one of these leaves. Now there are a few areas where one leaf is hanging out behind another, and you just want to make sure that you're creating a shadow there. The flower, no, the leaf underneath the other is going to be more in shadow. So you want to make sure that, especially when you're doing no line coloring, you want to make sure that you create that shadow so that it does look like two separate leaves instead of just one big blob. I also added a little bit of shading to the tip of just a few of these leaves, the ones that appeared to be a little bit more curved, just to add a little bit more shape. So you can see that I am using some flicking motions, and this is totally optional. If you haven't mastered the flick, don't worry about it. It's not mandatory, but it does just add a little bit more texture to your images, especially with leaves and flowers. And you can see that I'm not over blending here. In order to maintain that texture, you want to make sure that you're not over blending. You're just kind of extending those flicks where you left off with the previous color, and you'll be able to maintain those flick lines a little bit. So I'm going to finish off with the YG91, and you'll see that I'm starting with the tip and working my way down, and this is just so that I don't go over the darkest area with my lightest color. Remember, the lighter the color, the more it's going to act as a colorless blender, and it's going to move your color around in places you don't want it to go. So just be careful you don't go over the darkest areas with the lightest color. So once these were all colored up, I did go ahead and cut these out with my scan and cut and started to kind of figure out what I wanted to do with this card. I literally went into all 5 of these cards with no plan whatsoever. So I ended up cutting down my watercolor panel with a stitched rectangle die and used some of this pearlescent cardstock to cut that down just a little bit larger than the panel itself, and layered those on top of one another. I did have a little bit of warping with this watercolor paper, but really not that much. I did end up adding quite a bit of water, maybe not as much as I normally do, but still quite a bit of water, and I had hardly any warping at all. So once I layered this onto my card base, I realized that that pink was just too lonely. So I wanted to add a little bit more of that pink to really make everything pop. So I'm going to take another piece of white cardstock, and this is going to be a little bit larger than the pearlescent cardstock, but still smaller than my card base. In order to make this match my flower perfectly, I'm just going to take one of those mid-tone colors that I use to color the flower, and I'm going to go over all 4 sides of it. Started with the RV23 and realized that the chisel nib was a little bit dry, and I didn't want to take the chance of my whole marker going dry. I know it's very hard to get Copic refills right now, so I'm not taking any chances, so I ended up using the RV25. Then I can layer this onto this piece of cardstock that appears to be colored cardstock and layer that onto my card base, and you'll see that makes a huge difference. It really makes everything pop right off the page. For my sentiment, I'm going to create another sentiment strip, this time using the pearlescent cardstock, and you can certainly heat emboss on this. I had no issues heat embossing at all. You do want to make sure that you treat it with your anti-static tool, stamp the image with Versamark ink, sprinkled on some white embossing powder, and heat set that with my heat gun, then trim that down into a strip. And I wasn't sure about the length, so I kind of left the length as is for right now until I get my placement down. I ended up trimming the one side at an angle just because I feel like this adds a little extra interest to it. Totally optional. And then I will layer this with just some Tombow Mono multi glue. I'm keeping everything flat on this one, and then arrange my flower directly next to that. And that is it. That is it for card number 2. Next, moving on to card number 3, I am going to go ahead and stamp out some of, well, actually all of the images from the stamp set. And I'm using another piece of the watercolor card that comes in the kit. And you'll see it's going to look messy. It's going to look crazy. You're going to think I lost my mind, but just bear with me. Starting off with 3 of the images, just so that they don't overlap. And I can actually stamp it. It doesn't matter if they overlap in the end, but just so I can stamp 3 at a time. I am stamping with Blackout Ink by Ink on 3. You can use any Copic Safe ink that is also waterproof. So you want a waterproof and Copic Safe ink. And Ink on 3's Blackout Ink is both of those. And it's my favorite. So I went ahead and stamped these out twice. It doesn't really matter what kind of impression you get, but being this is textured cardstock, I did stamp them twice just in case I kind of lose some of those lines. Then I can take the other 2 images and I'm going to fit those right in the center. Now you'll see I'm not doing any masking. I don't care if they overlap, and I don't care if they totally reach the bottom of the panel. It doesn't matter. We can always fix that later. So I stamped these again twice with that Blackout ink, same way as I did before. And then we're going to work on our background. Remember, this is watercolor paper, and I'm going to do a watercolor background with some Distress Oxides. You can use anything here. I'm using 5 different colors: Abandoned Coral, Picked Raspberry, Carved Pumpkin, Wild Honey, and Squeezed Lemonade. I'm working on a Ranger craft mat here, and I'm just smooshing out some of my color or my ink onto that craft mat, and this is just basically going to be my palette. I'm going to take some regular water, just clean water, and pretty much get my entire panel wet. It's not overly saturated where it's pooling up, but it is pretty wet, just enough for my colors to blend out. Now, I'm not going to add color all the way to the top. Normally, I would tape this down, but halfway during this, I realized I want this to be a landscape instead of a portrait card, and I stamped this in a portrait style. So I'm going to end up cutting off the top. So this gives me an area to hold onto it. So I'm just adding my color, starting at the bottom with the squeezed lemonade and kind of working my way up to the abandoned coral. I did take a paper towel just to get up some of the puddles that form around the edges, especially as you add the water, the card starts to bend a little bit and all the water pools up on the sides. So I just kind of soak that up. I don't actually bring the paper towel to the paper itself. I kind of just let it absorb. Then I'm going to go in with a second layer because I know any kind of watercolor, or most kinds of watercolor, I should say, dry back, meaning they get lighter as they dry. So I want to do a second layer just to make these a really bright and vibrant even after they are dry. So once I was happy with the placement, I did add a few flicks of clean water as well as I think all of the colors just to kind of mix it up a little bit. And then I put this panel aside to dry. Once it was completely dry, we are going to fill in these flowers with a black marker. I'm using a Arteza Everblend marker. I do have a black Copic marker, but again, I don't want to waste my ink. So it doesn't require any skill to do this at all. I'm basically just outlining the image and then filling it in with black. And this is going to appear as if we used silhouette stamps, even though we didn't. We used regular stamps that you can color any color of the rainbow, but it's going to make it appear as if it's a silhouette. So for the flowers that the stem didn't quite make it to the bottom, not concerned about it because nobody's going to know where the stamp actually was. So as I'm filling in all of these areas, I'm just going to extend that stem all the way down to the bottom as if it's coming out from the bottom of the card. Then I'm just going to continue on. Obviously, our images overlap. Not a big deal because nobody's going to know we didn't do any masking because it's not necessary for this one. So just finishing up here, and then I can cut down my panel. So I left the width of it, what now is the width, but will eventually be the length, I guess you could say, maybe. And this is going to go directly in the center of my card. So I'm going to have a huge white border around this particular panel. I did also cut a piece of black cardstock just a little bit larger just to make it pop a little bit more. I love to layer things onto black cardstock. I really think it makes everything pop really well. Adhered this down with some Tombow Mono multi glue and didn't adhere it to my card base yet. First, we are going to work on the sentiment. And of course, I white heat embossed a sentiment, and I'm just using a scrap piece of that black cardstock that we had left over from cutting down this black panel. And then we can pop everything up on the card. I layered the entire panel with some foam tape, pop that up right there in the center. And for the sentiment, I just need to add a little bit of foam tape to the very top, which will be against the card base, and then some Tombow Mono multi glue that's going to be on the card panel. So that way it's nice and flush. Where there's dimension, there's still dimension with the sentiment. Hope that makes sense. Finished off with some shimmer just to the flowers and leaves. Started off with a Wink of Stella. That went dry. Switched over to a Spectrum Noir sparkle pen. To me, they're all the same. And that is it for that one. For the fourth card, we're going to bring out the Nina Desert Storm cardstock, and I'm going to use my colored pencils for this one and the masking fluid. So I'm going to start off with this leaf image, and I'm stamping this with Unicorn White Pigment ink by Hero Arts. And I like to use this with colored pencils. Just keep in mind that it does take a few minutes to dry. It's a very slow drying pigment ink, but it shows up really well on craft cardstock or the Desert Storm cardstock. I'm going to end up stamping this twice, but I want to stamp these one behind the other. So in order to do that, I am not cutting these little teeny tiny masks. So I am going to use the masking fluid by Nuvo. And this is extremely easy to use. To be honest with you, I've never used it before, but I knew that the stems and the leaves within this stamp set were going to be not so easy to cut out with masking paper. And if you guys watch my channel, you know that I love masking. So I figured this would be the next best thing. And it's very, very easy to spread. It flows out really nicely. You just want to make sure you don't really squeeze the bottle too much. If you squeeze the bottle, you may get some air bubbles and you may end up adding way too much masking fluid. But this I found was a lot easier to use than the other masking fluids that I've used in the past that seem to dry before you can even spread them out, and you end up getting that clumpy mess. I didn't get that with this. And it obviously is white, but once it's dry, it becomes clear. So you know when you're ready to go and when you're ready to move on to the next step. So I have one little area that's dry and that's still wet there, but I wasn't too concerned because I'm not going to go over that area anyway. So I'm layering my next, or the same image, but layering that again, and once again stamping that with that Unicorn Pigment ink by Hero Arts. This will, like I said, take a minute to dry. So before you remove that masking fluid, just give it a minute or so, because once you rub your finger over that pigment ink, you're just going to smear it. But the masking fluid comes right off with your finger. You want to use very, very light pressure. Don't press too hard or else you're going to tear the paper. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this on a smooth cardstock, like a Nina cardstock, because it's no longer going to be smooth. But in this case, I'm using colored pencils and it really doesn't make a difference. So for my coloring, once again, I am not going to show you all of the coloring, but I will show you just a little bit of it so you kind of get an idea of what I did. So I'm adding a little bit of the darkest color to the base of the leaf, and then I'm going to extend that out with and kind of go down. But I know that you've probably seen a lot of people color with colored pencils, and they use the white pencil kind of as the blender and to kind of top everything off and maybe leave the edges white. And I didn't necessarily want to bring white into this. I wanted this to match, because I know I'm going to be using that pearlescent cardstock. I wanted it to match that. So I'm going to bring in the cream color, which is, I mean, you could use it in place of white, but it isn't quite white. But you could kind of get the same effect. And I'm using that to kind of blend all of my colors together and also leave the tip of the leaf that cream color. So I'm just going to show you one more leaf. This is the one that's tucked behind the first. So again, I am adding that shadow to differentiate between one leaf and the next. Remember, this is no line coloring, so we don't have that black outline to fall back on. We need to make sure that the recipient knows that it's not a blob, it's two separate leaves. So I went ahead and finished up all of the coloring with all of these leaves. And honestly, it only took me maybe 10 minutes to do this. It really didn't take too long at all. Once that's done, we can finish up the rest of the card. I am going to take the pearlescent cardstock from the kit, and I'm cutting 2 strips. I'm not measuring, just cutting 2 strips. One thinner than the other, just to add a little bit something to it. And I'm going to layer these on top of one another. I do use wet glue primarily because I can never line things up correctly, and this gives me a few minutes to shift things around and make sure they are the way they're supposed to be. Then I lay this down onto the bottom portion of my card panel. For the sentiment, I am going to bring out some dye ink. I'm using the dark chocolate ink by Simon Says Stamp, and this will just be for my sentiment. I'm just going to stamp my sentiment directly onto the card panel itself, directly next to my leaves. Next, I wanted to use the twine from the kit, and change my mind here too, and it's mainly because of my lack of ability to tie a bow. So what I did was I wrapped the twine around this strip twice and then attempted to tie a bow. Now, usually if it's a ribbon, I don't have an issue, but for some reason, I really struggle with twine. I usually tie my bows upside down. For some reason, I can get them to lay better that way, but even tying this upside down and kind of messing around with the ends of the ribbon, or the twine, I really just couldn't get it to lay right. I'm just not good at tying bows. So I decided to nix the bow and I'm just going to wrap the twine around. Still adds something to it, but it's just a little bit easier. So I'm going to take some Scotch tape and I'm going to tape the one end down to the back portion of the card panel. Nobody's going to see this Scotch tape, so it doesn't really matter what you use. And then I'm going to wrap it around twice, just making sure that it's somewhat centered with those 2 strips of cardstock. And then I can tape down the other end to the back and just trim off any Scotch tape that might be hanging off the edge. Next, I'm going to line the entire back of the panel minus where the twine is, because we obviously already have dimension there, but I'm going to use foam tape. You can use fun foam as long as you cut out that little area so that everything kind of stays flush. And then I'm going to line this up onto my card base. I didn't leave any border, which I wish I should have, but I didn't. It is what it is. But everything will lay kind of flat with the dimension of the foam tape and the dimension of the twine. So of course, I can't get enough of these embellishments from Trinity Stamps. So I went ahead and added some of those around the sentiment, and that is it for the 4th card. For the 5th and final card, I am just going to stamp and color, just like I love to do. So I'm going to use all of the images in the stamp set again, and I'm working on a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, stamping these out with blackout ink by Ink on 3. Now you can use a stamp positioner here, but I'm just going to use an acrylic block, and I'm going to kind of squish these all together without having to mask. So I'm starting off with this bottom one here, and then I'm kind of just playing around with my placement. Now, photopolymer stamps are easy to bend and kind of manipulate in the shape that you want them, and the thinner they are, the easier they are to do that. So these stems on most of these flowers, you can kind of make these flowers face any direction you want. You can have them bent, you can have them straight, you can have them any way you want them, because the stems are so thin that you can kind of manipulate them a little bit. So I'm just finishing up stamping. You can see that one there in the center, my acrylic block kind of slipped out of my hand. So I have a really thick edge around that one, but oh well, it is what it is. So next I'm going to move on to the Copic coloring. I kept the Copic coloring pretty consistent, but I did leave all of it in here just because I know that usually when I cut the coloring out, I get a lot of comments from you guys that you want to see the coloring. So I left it in, mainly for the color combinations. For this first set of flowers here, you can see that it has some dash lines on the tips of the petals, and I'm using those to my advantage. This is going to guide me as far as where I need to put my shading, or where I should put my shading, just to give it some added texture and added dimension to the flowers. I'm also adding some shading to the base of each one of the leaves, and also where one petal is laying under another. You'll also see that one of the petals up there in the front is bent over on itself. That would also cast a shadow. So there's a lot of shadows on that one because it's bent over on itself. So the fold part usually is going to be the lightest part of that petal, I should say. So just extending everything out with the 2 midtones, and then I'll finish back off with the R81, which is the lightest color. And again, you just want to make sure that you're sort of careful not to go over those darkest areas with the lightest color. Next, we'll move on to this splotchy image that I stamped so horribly in the center. And I'm going to bring out Y and YR and E combination. Kind of a little bit of a mixture of everything. But again, I'm starting with my lightest color to get the paper saturated, to make my colors blend a little bit easier, and also to map out my darkest areas. Going to use the E39 pretty sparingly, just adding these to the very darkest areas. Again, where one petal is laying under another, and where the petals are coming from the center of the flower. Blending this area out with the YR27, and you can see that many of the areas I am using some flick lines, just again to add that added texture. Again, extending these areas out with the YR24, and then I'll finish back off with that lightest color that we started with, that R21. And I figured I really liked this color combination. It's really great for like a rustic wildflower look. So I'm going to use this same color combination for the center of that first flower that we colored, minus the E39. The area is so tiny, you don't need 4 colors. You don't need 3 colors. You don't even need 2 colors, but I did 3. So next, moving on to this, the center of the flower, I'm going to use the E18 as the darkest, and I'm just concentrating on the outer edge. Now for this next flower, I am going to bring in some BV markers, which are not something I use often, but lately I've been gravitating towards them. I like purple, but this is kind of more of a muted purple, and I felt like it really went well with the rusticy wildflower-ish look. So you've already seen me color at least a portion of this image when I was doing the no line coloring. So I'm not really going to explain too much of it because I pretty much did the shading the same way. It's obviously just a different color combination. Typically when I do no line coloring, I like to work 1 or 2 petals at a time, as long as they're not touching. I don't like to work with 2 petals that are touching when I'm doing no line coloring. But in this case, I stamped with black ink. I have that outline to fall back on. I feel pretty confident doing all of the petals all at once, and it kind of speeds up the process a little bit. So here I am extending these areas out. I think I'm on the lightest midtone, and you also see that I did continue with that little U or that little V shape on the tip of just some of these petals. Again, this is totally optional, but it just adds a little bit, just a little bit of texture or dimension to your images. And that wasn't the lightest midtone. This is the lightest midtone. So once again, I will finish off with that lightest color, being careful not to go over the darkest areas. I like to start off with the tips of the petal and work my way down, just because I tend to get a little carried away sometimes, and this way I can avoid that. So next, for these final flowers off to the right hand side, I'm going to bring in some more YR markers, and I'm going to change this in a minute. The more I looked at it, the more I didn't like it. But again, I'm starting off with the lightest color, and it's really not doing the shading any different than I did with the other flowers. And the YR27 is going to be the darkest color, which is one of the colors I used for the middle flower. And I felt like I really liked this combination, but I was running kind of low on some neutral tones that still had color, if that makes sense. So I brought in the YR24, but after the YR24, I brought in the YR04. And the YR04 is more of a brighter orange. It blends really well with the YR24 because they both end in 4. And so obviously they're going to blend nicely, but I guess I just didn't like how bright it was in comparison to the other flowers, but I'll fix that in a minute. Right now, I left it as is, thinking I would like it more as I looked at it, and I liked it less and less. So we'll fix it in a minute here, but I am going to finish off with that same lightest color that we started with. Once again, being careful not to go over those darkest areas. Now for the leaves, I'm not going to show you all of the leaves, especially the ones that you've already seen before, but I'm using 3 different green combinations, and this will kind of give you some variation as well, instead of just using the same green combination. So for this first one, I'm going to bring in those YR90 markers that we, YG90 markers that we used previously. I'm going to add a little bit of shading once again underneath the flower and on the base of each one of these leaves, where the one stem meets the other and where one leaf is behind another. This time I'm only using a 3-color combination because there's not a huge area to work with, so I don't need to use 4 colors here. So for the next combination I used for this image that you've already seen me color once, so I'm not going to show you again, but I will show you the 3 colors that I used for it. But I colored it pretty much the same way as I did when I did the no line coloring. So for the next combination, I'm going to fill in the remaining 2 the stems and leaves for the remaining 2 flowers, I should say. And this is just a 3-color combination, again adding some shading underneath each one of the flowers and on the base of each one of the leaves. Now this is where, as I'm looking at this flower, I'm hating it more and more. So I want to tone it down a little bit. So I'm going to bring in I'm having a hard time with Copic colors today. I'm going to bring in an E31, which is a very light brownish color, like a tan, and I'm going to go over the whole thing. I still have all the shading underneath it, but this is just going to tone down that brightness a little bit. So once all of my coloring was complete, I ended up trimming this down just a little bit because, like always, I want to mat this onto some black cardstock. So I took a little bit off the top and a little bit off of both sides, and I'm going to use 2 of the sentiments again from that 3x4 stamp set. For this first one, I'm going to heat emboss it right directly onto the panel itself. So I treated that with my anti-static tool, and I'm stamping this out with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is a quick drying pigment ink, but it's not quick enough where you can't emboss with it. So I sprinkled on some clear embossing powder. I prefer to do this rather than using black embossing powder. I find that even 1 or 2 little stray pieces of embossing powder when it's black or like a navy blue or anything like that really stands out. So I'm going to stamp the rest of the sentiment right below that. I didn't bother to heat emboss this. And then I will mat this onto a piece of black cardstock that is just a little bit larger than my card panel, but still a little bit smaller than the card base itself. Now, I did not warm up my heat gun before bringing this to the panel, and this is what I get. It's very warped. And so I'm having to kind of stick it down little piece by little piece, making sure that it's totally stuck down to the card base. So just make sure that you heat your heat gun up before bringing it to the paper. Don't do like I did. You can always put this under something heavy too, and that will help. So once again, finished off with a few of the embellishments from the kit, and that is it for the final card. So here I will give you a quick look at all 5 cards that I created. I will leave all of the supplies listed in the description box below, as well as the link to create an Inkspire. The kit is for sale to everyone, with members getting a 10% discount. So thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.